So next week we'll actually start to get into each one of the judges, or starting to look at a couple of the judges, Orthanel and Elud, I think, is who we won't actually probably look at them. We'll get into at least the introduction of them. All right, Judges, a brief outline of Judges 2 again. Just remember, God pronounced judgment on Israel, and it was for Israel's failure, and Israel's failure, and then we see God's patient response. And we'll see that again a little bit tonight as we look through this. And God dealt with Israel and exactly why. Remember, if you remember in the first few weeks when we got into this, when we started talking about Judges, we said one of the things is that Judges is a historical book, but it also is a spiritual battle that essentially is going on. While it does account of this time frame between this time that Israel is now in the land after Joshua has died to the time of the monarchs. So we have this intervening period here. So we see Joshua dies, and then we come and before the time of the monarchs, before the time of the kings, before Saul is the first anointed king of Israel, we have this period of time in there. And that period of time is where we see this sandwiched in here, if you will, where the book of Judges is at. And again, roughly 350 years or so, maybe longer, maybe a little bit shorter, depending on what commentary you look at and that kind of period of time. But for the most part, we see this time period that relates this opportunity for Israel really to do some things, and yet they continually fail at it. They continually fail. And you look at that, I think a slide up there that we look at every week, that cycle of sin that we constantly see. And just disregard, I know on page 1 I have that Deuteronomy 7. That's not even right. I forgot to pull that out again this week when I was working on it. But we see the cycle of sin that we see. We see that there's a silence from God. In other words, God's not speaking to anybody right at that point in time. The nation of Israel falls into sin. Once it falls into sin again, then we see servitude. In other words, what happens is that there comes this period of time where they're then put in servitude under someone else for whatever reason. Then we hear the supplication, the crying out. They're up in here, Shirley, somewhere. Mike's got them.
Sorry.
No, you're okay. You can come up here and sit by.
That's all right. I'm already.
Well, I mean, you can. She doesn't bite. Shh. You're not interrupting. We're tight-knit grouped here, so we're okay. That's right, I know. See, I know it. So then we see this time where they cry out. Salvation is then sent to them in the form of this judge. And of course, then we see where the silence picks up again. And then it goes through this cycle. And we've said before, as we've said several times, this goes on roughly about 7 times in the book of Judges. This is brought out about where how this pattern continues through their history, as it will, and we see how exactly God deals with it. And again, one of the things that we start with as we look at this, and it's the thing that always comes to us. So we're looking at this Old Testament book. Well, how does this affect us today in Christendom? What does this mean for us? And that's really what we're trying to get through as we look at this. And we know truly that in the Christian faith, many people start well. They come out of the blocks starting, they're on fire for the Lord. They come out of the blocks, they're ready to go, they're ready to do some things, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, they finish poorly. And why do they finish poorly? Because we've not done a good job at discipling people. We've not done a good job at coming alongside people and helping them work stronger in their faith. As we saw this happen in Israel, because what happened? They didn't get taught the precepts. They didn't get taught God's historical facts that they had done for them. And because of that, this generation never knew the Lord the way that it should. And because it didn't know the Lord the way that it should, what did it do? It fell apart. And we can see how that can happen. We can see that it happens in our life too sometimes. That they continually go through this cycle of sin and slavery and continue to do it. And so we know that. And of course, Paul writes in Galatians 6:6, do not be deceived. God is not mocked, and whatsoever a man sows, that thing he will also reap. And so that message not only is for us as Christians, but also was for the nation of Israel. What they sowed, they reaped. And particularly at the end of this chapter in verse 23, what's it say at the end of verse 23? It says that God left those people, those nations there to do what? Essentially be a snare to them always. And again, we've mentioned this before, that they're still a snare to them today. That they're still there for them today, and it always becomes issues for them that we have. Israel now has forgotten the wonderful blessings that God had given to them. The Lord delivered them from the slavery in Egypt, brought them from protection from Pharaoh's army, brought them across the Red Sea, and Israel forgot to thank God for guiding them through the desert and the Sinai. The leaders of Israel forgot to remind that the Lord was the one who sent man in the wilderness, and yet the people constantly grumbled against God. They constantly grumbled against Him, and they grumbled against Moses and Joshua, and instead of serving the Lord with fear, they continued to disobey the commands. And so because Israel forgot all these things to praise God, they refused His goodness, and they refused to obey His commands until it got to the point where they felt that they couldn't take it anymore. And how true, again, is that for us in Christendom today? We don't do anything. We don't do anything until we feel like we're in the deep bowels of whatever the circumstance or situation we're in, until we decide we're going to cry out. And that's why it's so precious with the things that we're doing. Like even the Women's Cry Out event, those kind of things, these kind of things that we have the opportunity to do now that we're looking to. We need to do this more and all the time, instead of just sometime that sparks us. Of course, that's the Cry Out event's what sparked it, but it's a good opportunity for us to continue to do that. Because why? Because that's what's going to draw us closer to God and keep us closer to God, so that we're not just crying out when we find out we're in a bad situation and all hope is lost for us. So that we're in this servitude, and then we're crying out for supplication instead of, and then we're looking for salvation out of it. We're looking for God to send something in our life to bring us out of it. And that's not where we want to be. All right, Judges 2, again, was really the seeds of apostasy. This chapter pressed home the reality that God's people are expected to live faithfully or experience His discipline, and rightfully so for us today too. As Christians, we're doing what? We have to understand that that's what God does to us too. We're going to experience that when we're out of God's will, when we're away from God. We're going to experience His discipline, and He just wants us to live faithfully. He just wants us to live faithfully. And when we don't live faithfully, there's going to be something there's going to be some kind of... Now, that doesn't necessarily... And the thing we have to remember is, sometimes we may not see that on earth here. It's funny. I was watching this thing the other day, and it was this series on false prophets, and it was going through a number of these false prophets that are out there for us today. It was showing Kenneth Copeland's I don't know how large his estate is and how much money he makes from it, or how much money it cost him for it. That's on the corner of a lakefront, and he has 3 or 4 different planes at his disposal all the time, supposedly for his ministry and all that kind of stuff. I'm jealous. No, I'm teasing. But it's these kind of things that you see that are what? They're deceiving people into pulling them away from God's message. And so as a result of that, what happens? Eventually, we may not see that here. He may never get judged here on earth, but eventually He's going to be judged for that. He's going to be judged rightfully so for His message to give us, as well as others. I mean, there was another, I'm not going to remember his name. He just bought another big jet too. Creflo Dollar. And he was talking about this in the passage he was given it out of. He was talking about sowing the seeds, and he was saying prayer doesn't help anything. You can only sow the seed, and that's the only thing you're going to get anything. So in other words, what he's saying is, or what he was saying, listen, if you give us your dollars, that's the only way you're ever going to see any increase in the dollars that you have. And that clearly is not a biblical concept. It clearly is not. It has nothing to do with how much we sow. God never promises if we sow every single dime that we have that we're ever going to get a dime of that back. Or if we sow all this seed, if we give all this money, how that's going to come back to us in some way. We know that if we give with a true and right heart, we know that there's going to be a blessing from that. But what is that blessing? It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be monetarily. That blessing comes in other ways. And so as a result, they lead people down this path. And these deceivers are going to be, they're going to experience some type of discipline at some point in time. And again, that may be the thing in Matthew 7:23 where it says, well, I've done everything in your name, Lord. And he says, listen, depart from me, for I knew you not. So that's the reality that we have to understand about God's message to us. All right, the biblical passages for this lesson, of course, 11 to 23. We'll go down through 11 to 19 fairly quickly. Spiritual adultery in 11 through 13, and then verse 17. Spiritual discipline, Judges 2, 14 and 15. Divine compassion, Judges 16 and 18. And then divine testing, Judges 2. That should be 19 to 23, really, because he continues to test them there. Now let's look at Judges 11 through 15. Someone read 11 through 15 for us. Read 11 through 15.
Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord. Should be my glasses. The God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths.
Yeah, Ashtaroths.
In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress.
Okay, and again now, in the notes there you see on that section, but I'm actually going to talk about a few more things than what's on the notes because we kind of looked at these last time. You see this, again, this cause and effect relationship that is here between what happens. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They served the Baals. Now, I just spent a little bit of time talking about the Baal. Baal worship, of course, pulled them significantly away. This worship of Baal and the Ashtaroths was kind of an exciting thing. It was sensual, it was sexual, it was pragmatic. It appealed to everything in the flesh. And because it appealed to everything in the flesh, it captivated people. And because it did that, it captivated the nation of Israel. It took them all in and really pulled them away from this. And even though God has warned them a number of times about this, he's told them a number of times, listen, don't serve false gods. If you serve those false gods, the bad things are going to happen to you. He repeatedly warned them. When they entered the land, he made that same repetition to them again where he said, listen, don't worship the gods. And Joshua 8 is the cross-reference for that. And he said that, listen, if you do this, because remember, it's not God breaking the covenant with Israel. God has never broken the covenant with Israel. You say, well, God's hands off Israel right now. Yes, it is. But it's off of Israel. Why? Because they have lived in sin and disobedience. Not because they broke the covenant and not God. God has never broken the covenant. We know that because we know if we go fast forward to the book of Revelation, we know what? That he's going to call those that are chosen out of Israel eventually, he's going to call them back to him. Eventually, you can't, in Israel right now, nobody knows their tribe. They don't know where they came from. They don't know what tribe they're out of. That's been lost a long time ago. But eventually that will come back. Those tribes will be called back, and they'll be identified by those tribes and everything in Revelation. And because of that, he has a special bond for Israel. And again, you've heard me say this from the pulpit too. The church did not replace Israel. You know, and that's one of the false teachings that's out there today. People teach this. Even in Baptist circles, some teach this. That's not a doctrinal thing. In other words, it's not a doctrine that we believe in. In the Southern Baptists, we don't believe that. That Israel was not, it's called replacement theology, that essentially what is replaced is the church replaced Israel, and that's just not the case. The Scripture, there is no place in Scripture where it says that the church will replace Israel or take away that bond that God has with Israel, because he still has a covenant with them. That covenant was established a long time ago, and it will continue through. So you just don't want to forget about that. But that because they do this, the Jews forsook that, and they didn't see God as relevant anymore in their new situation. And how many times as Christians do we hear that? You know, God's not relevant in my situation now. You know, God's not really relevant where I'm at right now. Yet God is always relevant. You know, yet people don't think he's relevant today. And so this circumstance and this situation, instead of letting God guide them and direct them, instead of pushing them, instead of looking to God and worshiping him the way they were taught, or the way they should have been taught to worship him, what happened? They walked away from him. They walked away from him totally. And so Israel didn't trust God for the victories, preferring a way to what? To turn to the idols. And of course they turned to the Baal and the Asherahs. And serve those, the foreign oppressors. So that's where they were at with it. And of course, we see what happens here. Look down at verse 15, if you will. And of course, wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for their calamity, as the Lord had said, as the Lord had sworn to them. They were greatly distressed. Well, why were they distressed? They were distressed because God's hand was off Israel at this point in time. So listen, you've broken my covenant. You've done these things, and because you've done these things, I can't allow it. God can allow his things to be taken care of. Now, Galatians 6, 7 and 8. This is out of the ESV. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that he will also reap. We read that one. We read 7 earlier. But verse 8 also says, for the one who sows to his own flesh, from the flesh will reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will, from the Spirit, reap eternal life. You see, in that, I could have used that when we were that last passage we were in 1 John here a couple weeks ago. The same kind of thing here is we see what? When we're reaping something in our flesh, the flesh reaps corruption. You know, and this is what happened with Israel. Just as Israel has done what? They've reaped in their own flesh. They've reaped the corruption of their flesh. And yet, when we sow from the Spirit, what's going to happen? We're going to reap eternal life. You see, and that's the point that we see here. You know, and you know, they thought it would be cool, but because of the consequences were harsh, they ended up in terrible what? In terrible distress. You know? They think, hey, this is all right. Look at my circumstance right now. Man, this is all pleasing to me. This is all great for me right now. And because this is all great for me right now, I'm going to continue on in it instead of turning to God. And see, this was just devastating. You know, and I would imagine Joshua and Moses and everybody else that's watching this at the time from heaven is just sitting there turning over, you know, because of what they're doing. But it's really no different than what they dealt with while they were there with them. You know, we know how they grumbled and whined and complained about everything all the time. It just never seemed to be a never-ending kind of thing with them. All right, let's look at Joshua 16 and 17. Someone read those two passages for us real quick. 16 and 17. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Judges. Yeah, that was me, speaking the wrong thing again.
Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods and bowed down to them. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers walked. In obeying the commandments of the Lord, they did not do so.
Okay. All right. So what's going on here in verse 16 and 17? So remember also when we first started in chapter 2, we said that chapter 2 was kind of another intro to the book, if you will. That chapter 2 was really a second intro into the book. And what do we see here in this intro? We see here that in verse 16 we see a part of this intro here where nevertheless the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. In other words, hey, I've heard your prayers, I've heard your whinings, I've heard your grumbling, I've heard all this, so I'm going to raise judges. And the word there, delivered, in the Hebrew really is salvation. I'm bringing salvation to you. I'm bringing those to you that's going to take them out of your hand, that's going to help you get out of them. And so he sent the judges to them, and we'll get to look at all these judges as we start to go through when we get into chapter 3 next week, and we'll start to see all of these judges and how and what they did. But what do we see here in verse 17 at the beginning of the verse? Yet they would not listen to their judges. See, they didn't listen to the judges. God said, listen, I heard your pleas, I heard your cries, I heard your prayers, I heard what you're going to do, so what I'm going to do is, I'm going to send somebody to you that's going to help you out. I'm going to send you a judge. Okay? And yet what happens here? The people just simply don't listen to him. They don't listen to him. They continue to do what? And the next part of that, we're between the commas there, but they played the harlot with other gods. And so they didn't listen to them, and they continued to do what? When he uses obviously the harlot there, it's talking about they prostituted themselves out with other gods. They essentially sold themselves to these other gods. And unlike their fathers who turned quickly away from it and walked away and walked in the way of the obedience to the command, in verse 17, what do? They didn't do it. We see this in verse 17. The fathers turned back to the God, but they did what? They failed to do that. They refused to listen to correction and instruction that the judge had brought before them. And because they refused to listen to them, Now, somebody read verse 18 for me. What happens?
Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, who was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived, the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them.
Okay, so what's the key in this verse here? What the key is for us in this verse, in verse 18 here, is even after not listening to God's instruction like the fathers did, God still heard their pleas, and it says what here in that verse? Lord raised up judges for them. The Lord was moved to pity their groanings because those had oppressed them and harassed them. You see, God still heard this. In the middle of all this stuff that's going on here, in the middle of all this stuff that continues to happen, God was still moved to pity on them. But again here, the picture is for us. Remember this, and you hear me say this all the time too from the pulpit. It's never about us, it's always about God. You see, God hears the pleas, but it's God's choice whether He does this or not. And He's only going to do things that rely in His character. And what's in His character? Mercy and grace. And so because He heard the pleas, what is here for us? The Lord was moved to pity. And God loves us even though we're in the middle of blowing it. And although He owes us nothing, He goes the extra mile to always rescue us out of that situation if we're truly in Him. And so we know that with this here, that in the book that we see this, that in verse 18 here, He had pity on them, and He was moved to help deal with them. Now, someone read verse 19 and 20 for me.
And it came to pass when the judge was dead, that they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers, in following other gods to serve them, and to bow down unto them. They ceased not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. And He said, because this people hath transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers. Sorry.
No, you're okay. Read.
Have not hearkened unto my voice. I also will not henceforth drive out any from before them of the nations which Joshua left when he died.
Okay, good. Thank you. So when we see this, it's interesting that Israel always hid their sins in their hearts, and David wrote this in Psalm 66:18, where he says, "If I hide iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me." And that's what continued. So they raised up a judge. They simply raised up a judge, and when they raised up that judge, it brought them to a place that essentially saved the people from the circumstances. But what did it not do? Their allegiance to sin and to the world was still there. You see, they didn't turn away from that. They should have been happy and pleased and just been excited because of what God had done for them. But because of this, because they continue to hide this in their hearts, God knew that. And their allegiance was still to sin and not turn away from it. And of course, we know that judge is one who pronounces judgment. Now, we know that they didn't act in a judging way, not hearing court cases as we would think of it today. He rules and provides justice by rescuing the people, and we've talked about that before. So as God appointed these judges, as God empowers them to deliver this godless people, it's all for God's kingdom and glory. That's the reason it's all done, in it. And so as a result from that, we see this going on here. Now, in this, I don't know, what slide are you on, Brian? 16 through 19, okay. That we see that then we get to God's response in verses 20 to 23. Anger broke out because because they broke his covenant again. In verse 20, we see this, that they continue to break this covenant with God. They continue to break this covenant that they had with him. And so because they continue to break this covenant, God was incensed with them, essentially. The people wouldn't listen. They went right back to their evil ways. They continued to do this. And Peter pronounces this in 2 Peter 2:22. He says, the dog returns to his own vomit and sows, and the sow, after washing herself, returns to and the sow, meaning the pig, after washing herself, returns to the wallow in the mire. Again, what happens here is that when we're living in sin, when we're in a part of this, what do? Our natural instinct is to go back to it, is to continue on to it. Continue into it no matter what. And so they never changed even though when they got their circumstances changed, it didn't change their nature. You see, their circumstances changed, but the nature didn't change. And so they continued to do what? They continued to follow this path to have, again, God intercede and rescue them again, or try to rescue them again, and bring them back to this. And so then we see that in verse 22, verse 22 was Israel's test of obedience for them. It essentially brought them to this place to test them and bring them out of the circumstances or situation that they were in. And yet, they constantly failed. They constantly failed. And then verse 23, look at it real quick. God did not give these nations to Joshua for this very purpose of what? Because they constantly were doing what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You see, they constantly did this. Now look at, go with me, just think about this for a minute as we go through this. Let me go to this. In verses 1 through 5 in chapter 2, they didn't try very hard to drive out the foreign gods. They didn't try very hard to do that. And because they didn't try very hard to do that, then in verses 6 to 10, because they didn't try hard to drive out those gods, they didn't, this is in your notes, this is me just bringing this all together for us. In verses 6 to 10, they didn't try very hard keeping that relationship going with God, so they didn't continue to establish that relationship with Him. So first of all, they didn't drive out the foreign gods like they were supposed to in verses 1 through 5. Then in verses 6 through 10, they didn't do what? They didn't continue to work on that relationship with God. They didn't continue to do that. Then in verses 11 through 15, there's an abandonment of that relationship with the Lord, and and they started to bow down before these other gods. So we see, you see how this process builds. if you don't know who this is, Casting Crowns is like my favorite artist in the whole world. And they have a song called Slow Fade. And in the song Slow Fade, it talks about this. That you just didn't wake up one morning and decide you were going to do this. You know, it's a slow fade. You fall into sin slowly. In other words, it starts with this thought, or it starts with this thing in our life where I didn't drive out this thing that I should have driven out of my life. Because I didn't drive it out, then my relationship with God starts to suffer because of that. And then what happens? I abandon that relationship, and then God says, listen, because of that, I'm going to give you over to it. I'm going to allow you to go through with whatever you're going to go through. I'm going to allow you to continue in that. Until we get down to where, in verse 17, where it says that they whored with other gods, which was more than just a one-night stand or an occasional dalliance with sin. It was a deliberate and constant and blatant intimacy with other gods. And for us, it's a blatant and constant intimacy with sin. You see? And that sin, it's no matter what that sin is. You see, because it's interesting, again, you know, I've said this 1,000 times before you too. You probably get tired of saying the same thing, but it's true for us all the time. You know, listen, if I gossip, it's no different than murder. You see? Now, oh, Pastor, you're saying, oh, my goodness, gossip is not that big a deal, but murder's a big deal. Okay, but God doesn't say that. You see, he makes that very clear. Gossip and murder are on the same level. It's all sin. He doesn't say sins. He says sin. Period. And so when we're participating in gossip or backbiting somebody or saying nasty things about somebody or doing these things that we think, or lying or doing these kind of things, it's the same thing as murder. You see? It's the same thing. And so when you look at it, when you put it in perspective like that, you start to think, oh my goodness. You know, and when we look at that as it becoming what? We deliberate it, we are engrossed in it all the time, and that becomes blatant intimacy with what? With this sin. And then it pulls us away from God. And what's that do in the church here? What it does in the church is it breaks down unity in the church. You see, it starts to break that apart. And that's where Satan likes to work at. That's how he likes to operate. You know, one little innuendo here, one little thought there, anything to pull a Christian away from the thing. And again, we go through the same process until seemingly simple disregard to an outright disloyalty to God. And then we suffer the consequences for it. You know, we see the same kinds of consequences we suffer for it as a result of it. And so, and let me just give you a couple things here that from lessons, and then we'll go through the rest of the slides here real quick. First of all, we know that in verses 1 through 5, you can't serve two masters. Okay? We can't serve God and manna. You know, it's impossible for us to do that. That's why one of the commandments is what? Have no other gods before me. Because God is a jealous God. And he has right to be jealous because he is the creator. And because he is the creator, what? He's jealous of us when we go after other gods. And so we can't serve two masters. And we know that. Jesus told us that. You know? You can't have two masters. You know? And so you've either got to pick one or the other. You know, either you're going to serve God or you're going to serve man. Or manna. Man, or whatever. It doesn't really make any difference. And then the second thing that we get out of the lesson here is that you cannot sustain a relationship with God without being in his word. 6 through 10. You know, if we're not constantly being trained in his word, you know, if we're not constantly in his word, then we can't train ourselves to avoid those circumstances or situations that may come up before us so we can avoid sin. You know, if we're not sustaining ourselves through his word. You know, and it's hard. It's hard. It's hard to do that. You know, I got to tell you, particularly as a police chief, even as a police officer, I had days when I'd walk in the office and 50,000 people are hitting me with 50,000 things at one time. You know, and not only are you dealing with this, but the city manager's calling me, or my council person's calling me, or this kind of thing, you know, and all this stuff going on. And it's hard to stay focused to say, listen, I need just a few minutes of quiet time here this morning just to get my day started, you know, and things. And so sometimes I get in the car and take off and go sit at a pond or something like that and read, because it can do that. But then it's hard to hide because you got a radio and you got a pager and you got phones and all that kind of stuff. But it's what? We've got to have that. We've got to make that time. You know, we make it for everything else. You know, I'm not going to miss a meal. Don't say anything, Shirley. I saw you look. You know, I'm not going to miss a meal. But you know what? I'm willing to miss my time in the Word of God, because that's okay. You know, see, but it's important for us to continue to build that relationship with. And you cannot escape getting burned if you stick your hand in the fire. You know, if you're going to play with fire, you're going to get burned. And so when we start to dabble in sin, and again, regardless of whatever that sin is, you know, whatever that sin is, when we start to dabble in it, we're going to get burnt from it. You know, well, we start to dabble in it. You know, again, as a police chief, I used to call this the midnight thing. You know, but you see it developing very quickly, and you try to do everything you can to get people to avoid it. But all of a sudden, you see this male officer having a lot of conversation with this female officer. You know, and you know they're both married to other people, and you see this starting to happen. I mean, you can almost, I can't tell you how many times I've had to call people in and have conversations with them about stuff. You know, and say, listen, you better not ever be doing anything at work, because if you do something at work, I'm going to fire you. You know, but we're not doing anything. Oh, my goodness, it's written all over your face. You know, that kind of thing that goes on because they were dabbling in it. They started dabbling in it. Now, a lot of these guys weren't saved. They had no relationship with Christ, so they're living in the world, so they're doing whatever they feel like doing at that point in time. But the point is what happens when we dabble in that kind of stuff. When it happens, we're going to get burnt from it, and eventually it does, because what happens? Somebody finds out about the relationship, and the next thing you know, what goes on? You know, people are getting kicked out of the house. Their stuff's on the driveway. You know, they're coming into work saying, giving me paperwork to say my wages are going to be garnished because I just had this happen, we're getting a divorce, all this kind of thing, and then it's a spiral downward, you know, and how it very quickly takes people out. You know, a really good friend of mine who was very well known in the community where we were from, up in northeastern Ohio. Matter of fact, I went to high school with him, was a good friend of mine in high school and everything, had the picture perfect life, had a great life. I mean, but this is what he did, and I saw it coming up for him because I saw him a few times out at different places and things like that, and I saw it, and he was dabbling in it. He finally ended up jumping in full things in an affair and all this kind of stuff, and it broke him. And stuff. And he's a great guy. No, he's not saved, but he's a great guy. But he let it, and of course it destroyed him. And he's finally picking up the pieces almost 15 years later. What happened to him, because he went straight down to the bottom. I mean, he went to the muck and mire, and you pay for it. And again, okay, let's go through this. Practical application: disobedience always brings judgment. The Israelites presented a perfect example of what we are not to do. Instead of learning from their experiences that God will always punish his rebellion against him, to continue to disobey, suffer God's displeasure and his discipline. We continue disobedience. We invite God's discipline not because he enjoys our suffering, because he doesn't want us to suffer. He doesn't want us to suffer, but he understands that we have to suffer sometimes in order for us to get back in line with him. Hebrews 12:6 says this: because the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes everyone he accepts as a son. See, I didn't discipline my kids because I hated them. You know, I disciplined my kids because I love them. You know? And I think I told you, I don't know if maybe I didn't tell you before, but we used to have this thing in our household that you said, well, you run like a court system almost. When you got caught doing something, okay, you had to come and first tell me what the offense was. What have you done? What did you do to be appearing in front of me right now? Why did you do this? You know, what did you do? And then it was a matter of this thing, okay, you know what you did, now you know what you did, because at first it's always, well, I don't know what I did, I couldn't have done anything wrong, I couldn't have done anything, I wouldn't have done, all that kind of stuff. But then it gets into that, okay, well, why am I spanking you? And it was this thing that we used to say, and you say, well, that sounds really stupid what you're telling me, but I think in some ways it worked, maybe it didn't, but I used to say, listen, why am I disciplining you right now? Now, I didn't use the word discipline, but why am I punishing you right now? Because you love me? Yes, Dad loves you. I love you, I care about you. That's why I'm disciplining you. Because if I don't discipline you, I'm going to raise a menace to society. See, that's what's going to happen. I'm going to turn out another menace to society if I don't discipline you now. And then I'd say, does Dad love you? Yes, Dad loves me. Do you love Dad? Yes. And because you're trying to restore that relationship right away. You want that bond to be back there right away. Because anytime you have discipline, it takes you away from the relationship. And so you want to do that right away. See, God disciplines the people He loves. See, that's why God disciplines us at times, particularly when we're out there. We're not going to turn to Psalm 106:34, but just read that when you get a chance. But again, this sets up the pattern that we'll see. We already saw that in Judges there. So let's conclude. Today our sins may not be exactly those involved in the ancient world in Baal. The principle, however, all apostasy is the same. Anytime that we involve a rejection of God's authority, and that doesn't make a difference what it is. Remember a couple weeks ago we read out of Galatians chapter 5 and we said, hey, this is what God hates. Those are the things that pull us away from God's authority. For people of every era, location in the world, sin is intrinsically wrong and provokes God's anger. For Christians, apostasy is moreover a violation of the new covenant relationship with God through Jesus Christ. It's turning our back on that relationship that we have with God. Now, so what are we going to do here? Just to conclude this whole thing. Holding on to the sin reflects a stubborn ingratitude and a lack of faithfulness on our part. Apostasy involves valuing something or someone above God. It also demonstrates a desire to intimate the world around us. Perversely, it also involves joining ourselves to people whom we know to be vile or to be our enemies. And as Christians, when Christian leaders praise false religions in the name of tolerance, we're doing the exact same thing. See, we want to avoid that. And apostasy denigrates and enslaves us. And it truly does. It tears us away from the truth of God's Word. That's why you guys got to hear too saying why I'm so heavy on doctrine all the time and understanding doctrine. Why when we're in passages, and why I believe expository preaching is the only way to go, because it delays from taking agendas out of it keeps us from putting our own agenda in front of the people when we do a verse by verse study. You see, it takes it away from that because we're dealing with the passages there, and that's why it's so encased in that verse-by-verse study. We pull doctrine out of that. Why do we do that? To make us stronger so that we can keep away from those things, because we don't want to be like the Israelites. We don't want to be like them.